Thank you, Ryan, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's good to be back, right?
That's true, yeah.
Although I was remarking that I don't think in all the years I spent at Stanford, which was quite a lot, I don't think I ever stepped into the law school. So this is a great pleasure. And I have to make one apology, which is I'm just coming at the tail end of a cold, and I may just break out into a coughing fit, which has been happening to me from time to time for the past few days. So forgive me. Don't feel, I'm not, it's not life-threatening, but it can be pretty bad. Okay, so here's my throat lozenge, just in case. I'm talking about privacy online today, and you see my title. Okay. Those of you who've been following, maybe just a quick show of hands, how many consider yourselves to be experts or particularly interested or have been following privacy issues? All right, so then you'll know that privacy, it was a big year for privacy online. There were lots of front-page news stories. And maybe the thing to remark was that privacy stories had become seen as news stories. So you had the various, what to us seemed like embarrassing moves by Facebook to do one thing and another that drew all sorts of protests. You had Google Buzz, which didn't end so well for Google. And then you had both the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Commerce writing reports about privacy online, the Department of Commerce and the FTC just generally looking at consumers and privacy. And I would say that one of the watershed publications of the year, which I believe is still ongoing and I highly recommend it, is the Wall Street Journal series called What They Know. It's just incredibly informative and relentless in its revelation, and maybe that more than anything else got people to thinking that something should be done about it. Now, I wanted to talk about why I think privacy online is different, and invoking some of the theoretical framework of contextual integrity that I've been developing for a number of years, and as Ryan mentioned, was part of, is what the book Privacy in Context develops. And the way it identifies privacy problems is, as I've kind of structured the ways in which online interaction is different. One is that the online environment provides new types of information that we haven't been used to engaging with. And so sometimes we just aren't sure about how to work with this kind of information, clickstreams, IP addresses, profiles, online identities, and so forth. Then we have new and different kinds of actors, those who are sending information about, those who are the subjects of the information, those who are the recipients or the receivers of the information. And some of you who may have been in the business for a long time or perhaps are fans of John Perry Barlow may remember this particular phrase in one of John Perry Barlow's very early works: businesses you never heard of can own the history of your personal affairs. So this was something that he said 2 decades ago, and it remains ever more true today. We have our ad networks, the analytics companies, and in fact, the entire planet, or everybody who's at least connected online, has access to information about you that didn't before. And then finally, there are these different modes of capture of getting the information. And if you would go back to something that's, prior to online networks, perhaps we're in the same room, we see each other, there's a cross flow or reciprocal flow of information between us, and of course that's not then and now, there's plenty in between. But we have these unusual modes of capture that we're not sure what to do with. Sometimes the very act of interacting leaves footprints, and those can be captured. We have the use of cookies and flash cookies and beacons and furtive capture, and a lot of what's driving all this is this massive information marketplace that exists not only online, obviously, but offline in the hands of private actors like ChoicePoint and Axiom, and then, of course, government actors who are also really interested and also the customers of a lot of this information that's being captured and generated. Now, I just want to do, some of you may be aware of a little piece of software called Ghostery, which I have, it's a Firefox extension, and all it does, or the main thing that it does, is when you go to a website, it tells you how many trackers there are, so that when you're going to a website and you're thinking, oh my God, this is taking a long time to load, what's really going on, I mean, it may be a fault of the website too, but often what's going on is that the website is calling these many, many different actors who are hopping on board to see what you're doing. And this is just some random cooking blog. It's a great recipe, by the way. And then here's another one. This happens to be a political discussion board, a progressive political discussion board, and look how many trackers they have. And here's, I felt in fairness, I had to put Fox News, not quite as many trackers, but okay, anyway, you get the point. Blue Kai is just one of the multiple companies that is part of this large engine of collecting information, aggregating it with multiple sources, so that even if you think that you've deleted your cookies and next time you visit a website you come in clean, these companies like this can guarantee that your profile can get re-peopled or re-substantiated with the information that they've been collecting and holding steady for other companies to use. And besides these, maybe you might consider creepy kinds of surveillance happening in the background, there are ways in which the online environment presents certain problems to us that may come only after a few moments of reflection, and I'm just telling you anecdotally what happened to me because I subscribe to the New York Times at my home, and we're being encouraged to take the subscription and put it online. And what I'm thinking about it is that it seems it's the same thing. I'm subscribed to the New York Times. I'm just going to take my subscription online. And as I was thinking through this, I'm realizing that the one difference, of course, is that they can monitor what I'm reading. So they can monitor my clicks from place to place. Now, as a matter of fact, when I've described this sort of realization, even having been in the field of privacy for so long, someone mentioned to me that, in fact, your email address is much better protected than your actual home address, which companies like the New York Times can freely ship around and send to others. But that's not part of the discussion today. Anyway, what has been done about this? What is the dominant or the predominant approach with dealing with the concerns that have emerged about online tracking and the aggregation of your activities and so on? The predominant approach at the moment is one that's called transparency and consent. And some of us know it better as notice and consent. And if you're in the research or the medical field, then you probably know it as informed consent. And it's operationalized at the moment as voluntary enforceable privacy policies. So, for instance, here's Google's page. There was a major struggle. Google didn't want to put this on their front page, but eventually they did, and probably in the tiniest font. Can you read it? Anyway, that's the privacy policy. So if you want to be a respectable website, then you need to have a privacy policy. And this is what you can see, the Google's very complex privacy policy, and at the top, they subscribe to this particular approach, which we're calling here transparency and choice. It's very familiar. Now, here's, I want to just now give you an overview of how the rest of the talk is going to go. First of all, I want to explain why I think notice and consent, or transparency and consent, have been so dominant and widely accepted by a whole variety of stakeholders. Then talk a little bit about the trouble with notice and consent, both the way other people have identified the trouble, and imagine people in this room have been following some of the debates about this. And finally, what I would like to recommend as an alternative, and this is drawn on the theory of contextual integrity. So somewhere in the middle there, I'll just do a very quick primer on contextual integrity. So why do I think notice and consent is has been, why different people have been so receptive to this idea? First of all, there is a vision or a view or a conception of privacy, and maybe you can trace this back to Alan Weston, but it has a very strong hold, a definition of privacy as control over information about oneself, or personal information for short. And if you accept this definition of privacy, it makes sense to believe that if someone is going to be using your information, capturing your information, analyzing it, sharing it, or whatever, then at the very least they should ask your permission, because that's the way you model, in this relationship, control over information about oneself. Now, in the book, I have a very extensive argument about why I think this is a bad idea, and the definition doesn't hold. It doesn't benefit the value of privacy to think about privacy in this way. I do think that control is an important aspect of privacy, but I don't think it's a good thing for us to define it as control over personal information. And so I'm not going to continue focusing on this rationale for notice and consent. The next one is kind of interesting, because the view, I think, is that we have the net, and I'm using the net to fudge, because most of the time I'm going to be talking about the web, because most of our experience is on the web, and a lot of the way most people interact with the net is through the web. But I'm going to use this because I don't think it's restricted to the web, is that we have the net as a competitive free market. We have actors in a competitive free market. And so what you want to establish is that people engage freely in this competitive free market, and you want to hold at bay any kind of substantive interference from third parties, such as government regulators. And this, so the argument goes, is going to be for the greatest benefit of society. And finally, there's a point that's related to this that says we're still early days in this technology, and we need a lot of flexibility. We don't want to regulate. This is the best way to maintain flexibility and innovation, so that we can change with the times and with the tastes, with people's tastes. Now, the trouble with notice and consent is, I would say it simply hasn't worked. If this is the protections we have in place, and you're seeing what we're seeing with all the trackers and the flow, just unhindered flows of information, I would just say whatever we're doing now, it's not working. So that's not argument number one. There's a group of people who I'm calling critical adherents, and what they say is that notice and consent, transparency and consent, is still a good idea, but it simply hasn't been operationalized properly. And what they argue is that it has been operationalized badly, both in the transparency end of things and also in the consent end of things. So, for instance, one of the debates that continues to happen is whether opt-out is the right model for consent, or whether you need opt-in, which seems a much more proactive engagement with a particular choice. And we know that it makes a huge difference as to whether people are or are not going to engage. So that's one concern that the critical adherents have. Other, I think, slightly more subtle concerns have to do with what free choice actually amounts to, and how much pressure a person has to be under when they're making the choice in order to say that this person is truly making a choice, or whether they're under sufficient duress to start questioning whether this is a free choice after all or not. And then, of course, there's been a lot of discussion about the notice or the transparency part of the engagement, because anybody who has just taken a moment to look at the privacy policies that are around today, maybe even law school scholars, of which I assume some of you are, will immediately see that these are not documents that anybody can read on a regular basis if they want to have a life in which they're doing other things, like going to the gym and studying for exams and so on, because people have calculated just how long it would take if you were going to read privacy policies of every website, and it's a rather long time. They're long, they're abstruse, they're full of loopholes, questions, and they're bad. So that's the concern. And the proposals, there have been a lot of proposals, and if you read the Department of Commerce report and the FTC report, there's a lot of discussion about moving to different formats of notice, and there are suggestions to take notice and squish them to something that looks like a nutrition label, so that you know at a glance you have an idea of what's going on, how this particular website is dealing with your information. And I've come up with this notion of a transparency paradox, or a transparency dilemma, if you will. And it came about by doing some research looking at Google's policies relating to cookie anonymization when there was a lot of pressure on search engine companies to not to maintain identifiable logs for as long as they were doing so. And when you read the policy very, very carefully, and you said, I'm going to take seriously everything in this policy, there were still many points at which you weren't sure if they were doing A or B. And if they were doing A, in fact, re-identification of the information was a lot easier than if they were doing B. I just want to, I meant to say this because Ryan's introduction was so generous, that although I worked in the symbolic systems program, and I did some programming and so on, but I work with a lot of fantastic computer scientists, and so I can't take credit for any of the actual system building, but they teach me a lot, and so I'm really fortunate to be able to learn some of this stuff from them. In any event, what I realized, and we actually then had some conversations with the Google engineers, and it turned out that they were actually doing some of the better, they were making what we considered to be the better choices. But you couldn't tell that from the policies, because they said it would just take too long, and we would have not as much flexibility to improve the underlying technology. But the takeaway message, the lesson from that is that in a privacy policy, if you're interested in certain key questions about how long the data will be held and how easily identifiable and who's going to get the data, the amount of detail that the policy actually has to contain to give you that information is just way more than anybody who's sitting at that moment having to make a meaningful decision. So it seems to me you can either have transparency of language, I can read it and I get it, it's 10 sentences long, and then you're really you're not knowing what's going on underneath. Or you can get all this information where you have all the details you need, and it's incomprehensible. It doesn't seem in this situation that if you're saying the end purpose is to make a knowledgeable decision, that you're going to find the right way to articulate notice. Now, people have come back to me when I've made this argument, and they say, but your standards are too high. Look at the medical realm, or those of you who conduct human subject research. You're providing people with these informed consent forms, or if you're about to undergo some experimental treatment, or you're about to have some surgery, you sign the medical consent form. So it seems to work over there. Why are you pessimistic about it not working here? And I thought about that. What I think is the case, because, and having gone through this and had surgery myself and signed those consent forms, is I was not reading the consent form closely. And in fact, there was a recent article in Scientific American that shows that people actually don't read consent forms very closely, and they really don't know what the risks are and don't understand a lot of it. I was signing because I trusted the caregiver, who I had done some research on. He had a good reputation. He'd gone to medical school. He had signed the Hippocratic Oath. The hospital probably was worrying about insurance, and it's NYU hospital, blah, blah, blah. All those were the reasons I signed the consent form, not because I read the notice very carefully. And so what I think is missing from this transparency and consent, if we can mess around with that notice as much as we like, but unless we can build the safety net of trust, a greater understanding of this relationship, I don't believe that we can rest everything on the notice and consent, as much as it's an attractive thing for those who support it. So what to do? And now we get to that part of the argument. By the way, this goes until 2?
Yeah, you have until 2.
And then discussion. Yeah. No. Yes, yeah, that's what I thought, but I just wanted to check. Yeah, okay, good. So this is quite a radical claim to make, and by the way, I do think there still will be a role for informed consent, but I want to see if we can do some work on this environment where maybe the role of the informed consent is a little bit more as what's going on in the medical arena. But I should again say that when I've given this talk or made this claim, I haven't actually given this talk before medical practitioners, or people in research, they'd say, it doesn't work so well there either. So it's not a good idea to idealize. Because I don't want to stop simply by showing how bad transparency and consent is, and I don't think that it can really carry the weight of protecting privacy online. So what can we do about it? And this question has taken me back to asking, what is online? What is the internet? What's the net? And of course, this is a grand philosophical question, and many people in the area of information law and in other areas asked this question decades ago: is cyberspace a different realm, and so forth? And my feeling at this point about what the net is, how it plays in people's lives, what it means to people, is that it's highly heterogeneous. I think of it as a media space, perhaps because I'm in a Department of Media Studies. It's a media space. It's highly heterogeneous. There are just multiple different kinds of experiences, and it's thickly integrated into social life in general. When Senator Kerry proposed, or at least said, that he is going to back legislation for online privacy, I was happy that there was someone talking about legislation for privacy, but I was concerned that we should identify the online realm as somehow deserving some kind of special legislation. This seems to me a mistake, because the online space is so thickly integrated into social life in general. Now, in some cases, at this point, and maybe it wasn't the case, well, it certainly wasn't the case a couple of decades ago when people first started asking these questions. At this point, we have established institutions who are now interacting with us online, like our banks. We have bookstores. We book our flight reservations online. We engage politically with our political representatives, or civic engagement with cities and so forth. So a lot of, you might say, of the reason it's so integrated with social life generally, is that a lot of what we would have done socially generally is now mediated online, and so it's not surprising to come to a conclusion like this. And then there's sort of, I don't want to say weird to prejudge it, but then there's somewhat, things that are somewhat more difficult to place. I don't know how you feel about things like online churches, but some of them have maybe a completely different feel to them. Something like search engines, you may consider social networks of course Facebook, but any forms of the specialized social networks that are out there, including social networks like Flickr. So you have this integrated and heterogeneous media space. So at this point, we're going to just pause a moment and think about, and let me just describe a little bit about the theory of contextual integrity, which is a theory of privacy. Contextual integrity wants us to think about social life not as undifferentiated space, but as differentiated into different domains or realms or spheres. And it's not something that the theory itself invents, but it comes from social philosophy, social theory, where there are many different theories and different approaches about thinking of social life as differentiated into these different realms. And these realms have a variety of, think about them as canonical roles and activities, and of course norms that govern how we act in these different realms. And among the norms that govern these spaces, these contexts I've called as an abstraction on any of these particular theories, you have norms that govern our activities. And some of the norms are explicit, some of them are embodied in law, many of them are simply understood, and maybe an anthropologist might go into a community and say, gee, I want to see what norms are governing the interaction. So it's not clear that the norms, and sometimes there's disagreement about what norms are actually in place. So it's very messy. It's messy like society is messy. But informational norms are among the norms that govern, and in this case, govern the flow of information. These informational norms, and this is part of the model that I've built on regarding contextual integrity, have a certain shape to them. And what they do is they prescribe the flow of information based on the actors, which is sender, recipient, and information subject, in particular the roles of the actors or the capacities in which the actors are acting, the type of information that's in question, and the transmission principles. What are the constraints under which the information passes from one actor to another? Now, there's a descriptive component to contextual integrity, whereby if you're an anthropologist and you're going into a community or into a realm and you want to understand what the entrenched norms are, you can study what the entrenched norms are. But then you can come in as an ethicist or a political theorist and say, these are the norms, are they good norms? How do you evaluate norms? And because information technology has had such a radical impact on the flow of information, this is a moment, I believe, in which many of these norms that have been entrenched, and even if they're entrenched, they evolve, and because of globalization, different cultures have different norms, and they clash with each other, and it's a big mess. But technology has had a huge impact and disrupting and threatening some of the norms. And the question we ask then is, we don't want to be conservative and just say no to any changes whatsoever. We want to have at least some mechanism to evaluate whether the challenges that we're confronting are ones that we should accept and embrace, and there are many that we should, compared to those that we want to resist. We want to say, we're not going to let the technology dictate the norms. Sometimes people will say things like, the technology imposes new norms. No. Technology is not the mechanism for imposing the new norms. Technology can disrupt norms. Technology can change practice, But the edge of that, we daren't let the technology determine morality for us. That's the position I hold. I know some may decide to argue, and it takes us into realms of philosophy of technology that I would love to go to if that's your interest. But in any event, the way the theory of contextual integrity handles this is to say that when you have norms that are challenging when you have practices that are challenging entrenched norms, what you need to do is an analysis or an evaluation, a comparative evaluation that says, how does this play out in terms of general moral and political values? That's very important. Does it promote freedom, autonomy? Does it harm people, etc.? Just the kind of analysis that many privacy theorists have been doing for years and produced great bodies of work. And the one additional layer that contextual integrity brings to bear is, first of all, in those kinds of analyses, you will almost inevitably come up with a clash of values, at least in the hard cases. And I mean, certainly things like medical technology, say the greater ability to monitor patients in a hospital. Of course, these are disruptive of entrenched information flows, but we welcome them. And what's the reasoning behind it? One is that the healthcare context has certain values. It has purposes. It has goals. And if you can argue that the new flows that are brought about by these changes of technology are better at achieving these ends, purposes, and goals, the internal purposes and goals of context, then you have an argument for accepting the changes and rejecting what might have been less efficient, less effective flows of information. And often I think reputational systems are a good example of where we can really benefit from these disruptions in flow. Now, there may still be some who argue, but you're wrong. You're wrong because online really is commercial. It isn't all these other things that you're saying, because the online realm, if you look at like the political economy, much of it is privately owned, and it's based on private income from advertising. So it's okay that it's governed by these commercial practices because it is commercial. And that too was something that I considered, and at the same time I was reminded of this particular quote. Can everybody read it? Just give me a sign. Can you read it? Otherwise I'll read it. Yes. And who said it? Yes. Did you guess or did you know? Who said that?
I didn't know that I knew.
Oh, okay. Okay. Brilliant Page in a 2007 paper in which they introduced Google to the world, the search engine. They had an appendix.
1997.
1997. 1997. They had an appendix that ended with this. Now, so this was a concern, and I decided I don't think that it's okay. Google is now fully supported by advertising, and they're doing everything that Brilliant Page said that they thought was a bad idea. But I didn't see that as a problem. And here I'm very much influenced by the work of Elizabeth Anderson, who's a political philosopher. And her argument is this: we have lots of realms in life. We have these norms that govern these different realms, and what she doesn't call them norms, she calls them standards of excellence. And within these different realms, we can have these hybrid situations, doctors, physicians who run private businesses, if you will, and a dermatologist's office that might put Botox pamphlets in the waiting area. And that's fine as long as they're not completely governed by the marketplace norms. These realms have internal standards of excellence. I think we can still say about a search engine, whether or not it's privately supported by advertising, whether or not it's privately owned. IMDb, started out as this volunteer enthusiasts putting information they knew about movies and movie stars. Now it's owned by Amazon. The standards of excellence don't need to change simply because something is owned. We can still argue that a search engine is a good or a bad search engine, irrespective of whether how it's done and so on, of course, makes a big difference. But we still believe that there are these internal standards of excellence. And so I didn't think that it doesn't matter how much is owned by government and how much, et cetera. We want to acknowledge that there's still these internal standards of excellence that bear on the different contexts online. So what finally is the proposal that I would like to put before us to shore up this, what I think to be an empty and bankrupt transaction, transparency and choice. And that is to not be afraid to locate these contextual affinities, to recognize, to look at the interactions that we're engaging in, some of us more than others, and recognize, I am banking, I am making a reservation. This entity is calling itself a university. Let's take it at face value. If it's a university, we know what the internal standards of excellence are for educational institutions. I exaggerate. I know that it's a point of contention. Every society is constantly having discussions about what schools should be doing and why they're not performing as well as they should. These are contested. But nevertheless, let's identify, let's locate, let's not throw up our hands when we come to a website and say, we have to re-engineer this relationship as if we don't know anything about social life. We know a lot about social life, not just from ourselves, but from the traditions into which we're born. We know a lot, cultural knowledge. So if you call yourself, if you identify these contextual affinities, you can import at least many of the norms, the expectations that you have in these engagements. And then and a lot of this has to do with seeking coherence or integrity of social life. And this is actually a part of the theory of contextual integrity that I didn't bring out, but I did it quite a lot in the book. And that is that too many theories of privacy focus on a right to privacy or the reason to respect a right to privacy as a protection of an individual against a harm. And what I argued and had many different examples is that, in fact, social integrity depends on restricted flow of information. And I'll just give you one brief example that I think we in academia may feel, experience, and that is something like confidential letters of recommendation. It doesn't matter where you lie on this, and people may differ. But one thing you know for sure is the letters are going to be different if they're confidential or not confidential. And just that knowledge, then you want to say, that difference that it makes, is it productive for promoting the aims of this particular context, understanding what the aims of that context are. So it's really about not only protecting the individual against harm, but also sustaining some of the societal institutions that we respect and hold dear. So as a second step, in some cases it's going to be quite easy to locate these contextual affinities. In some cases it's going to be quite difficult, and because there are these weird and exciting and different kinds of experiences that we have online, we may need to do more deeper thinking to understand what again, what purposes, what are the values, and so on, what seem to be good rules that would promote the ends of this particular activity. And I have no doubt that even after you've done all this, there are going to be instances in which we don't know what to do. Now, the difference between that situation that we're going to be in and the situation that I outlined right at the beginning, in which every single interaction has to be, call it contracted and new, is that we're going to solve some problems. We're still going to have hard problems that are going to be impossible, and maybe we're going to need to just settle for transparency and choice in those cases. But in the other cases, I would like to recommend that we actually write out substantive rules that govern, rules of expectation that govern the flow of information in those cases. Don't punt. That's my final thing. Don't punt. We have a lot of knowledge about social life, and we can bring it to bear to our benefit. Thank you. No, no, man. Yeah, sure. Eric.
If I understand your argument, it seems that you're suggesting we should honor tradition. We have ways of doing things in the past. With new technology, we need not do anything than what we've done in the past. And it seems that that creates two problems. One is that the technology may enable things to be done that have never been done before. That may be the hard cases that you excluded away in your disclaimer. And two is that the semantic ambiguity in the institutions that you're describing become really paramount as technology evolves. And I'll give you the example. What is an email today? What are the norms that we have about email, and when do we know if something is still an email? Is a chat session an email? Is a pop-up window an email? Is a web form an email, et cetera? So it seems that both you're perpetuating tradition, not recognizing the new things that we can do, and B, you are assuming that these institutions are semantically coherent enough that we can identify them over time.
It is traditional. It is traditional. The fundamental belief here is that at any moment in social life and culture and whatever, we have these norms that we subscribe to, and we don't challenge those norms all the time. And those are the defaults. And the reason that's my starting point is that maybe, it's a faith in the fact that we've evolved to these norms. We've evolved to these norms, and that we have them, and they're in place for certain reasons, and that they help to promote certain ends, which doesn't mean they can't be challenged, but that's, yes, it is built into the theory. Now, what you say about some of the ambiguity, it's important, and especially now, I know there are people who are working on what the rules for emails should be. I suppose stepping back, what I would want to say is I don't want to get into the definition of what email is and what it isn't. I want to go back to Benjamin Franklin, who, at least so the stories go, at a time said, if the US Postal Service is going to be useful for the following purposes, then we need to guarantee that people aren't steaming open letters, or the people in the post office, among others, are not steaming open letters and seeing, because you could have a different. I don't think it's a matter of like fundamental human right. It's to understand how the various policies, in this case, you develop are going to affect the usefulness of the particular medium for a particular purpose. That's how I would, instead of looking at like, is this email or isn't it email, but just say, what kind of functionality. I suppose that's why I developed the theory the way I did, because I found that to be a convincing way of thinking about the policies. We could go either way. Ryan. Yeah, and I see you.
Was there
question there?
Yeah, but
Okay.
you go.
So this is really great, and I happen to be thinking a little bit about the same kinds of questions, and it interests me just how sort of differently I think about some of these issues than you do, although I can certainly see the attraction to this sort of framework. But I wonder why you think that some of these solutions are not actually, in essence, a form of notice.
Okay.
So there's this club in New York City
Mm-hmm.
called Limelight. You ever seen it? It's in a deconsecrated church.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like this Gothic church, but it's like this club. And what they're playing on is this tension between this holy place that they have somehow co-opted and made into this club, so that anything goes environment, people are drinking and dancing. So, but in essence, a church announces itself and what the standards and practices are by its very architecture.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you walk into a place, whether it's in New York City or in Europe or whatever, you see the vaulted ceilings, you see the light coming in through the windows, you hear the silence, and you know
Mm-hmm.
what the rules are, and you have a certain set of expectations. You didn't have to read a policy on the way in the door to figure out how you're supposed to behave and to set your expectations appropriately, right? Why can't websites do that? I mean, in an environment where, because to me what's unique about the internet is the things you said, but also the fact that it's a mediated space. That is, every aspect of it is constituted by something. It's designed. Why can't we design websites in a way that are intrinsically transparent, where people understand what the expectations ought to be, thereby bypassing some of these concerns we have about the fact that it's really hard to get fulsome disclosure consistent with brevity, which has worked at Howard Latin evidence is very well, and we talked about, and recently Ben Shahar and Schneider have some stuff on this. It's totally true. We all agree it's right. It seems to me, I guess another way of saying this is, fighting against notice or criticizing notice on the basis of privacy policies feels a little bit to me like criticizing fish on the basis of piranhas. You know, I mean, privacy policies are terrible. No one reads them, etc. But that doesn't mean that we can't somehow leverage notice. Maybe by setting expectations with design, maybe by making it just in time, as some of the folks like Lori Kramer talk about. Maybe by focusing more on warnings than terms. And so I guess I confess I'm a little bit of a critical adherent, as you put it. I love that phrase.
Yeah.
Because I think we can do this right. It's just that we've been doing a crappy job as lawyers who don't understand how to design things.
There's a hell of a, you can have a, I don't think you're so far from me in perhaps. Because the example you gave about the church was, I was going along with it and I was saying, we don't disagree with each other at all because you've identified yourself as a church. And that churchness connects to a particular social realm or social institution that we're familiar with and we have expectations surrounding. And so that the reason we don't have to do all the work in the privacy policy is that we bring to bear all these expectations and we expect the expectations to be met. If you're going to believe, Bentham about why a secure society is one in which expectations are met. There are a lot of, you might call conservative thinkers, and one of the ideas is that a secure society is one in which expectations are met. So I'm all for it. Maybe where we part company is to say that you can enter the church and then every element of that relationship is up for grabs and you somehow need to communicate every element of that relationship in whatever, even I'm sure, fabulous fabulous interface that you design. And maybe, again, where we part company is I want these expectations to come from entrenched social realms. And that we may disagree on. That, you may think that we need to start every relationship afresh and develop the terms of our interactions from the ground up. And my argument is that's a bad idea. We don't need to do it. And we're never going to be able to communicate everything that a person needs to know in order to engage properly. But I think that maybe we're not so far, but we just need to tweak the details. Yeah. The back? And
I guess I'm curious as to how this would apply to transnational and transcultural sites. I mean, one of the fundamental aspects of the internet is that it theoretically should be available everywhere. And you can look right now at Facebook requiring people to have true identities. Might not be such a big issue here. It might be a bigger issue in the Middle East. You don't have to go that extreme. We have websites that might be perfectly acceptable in San Francisco, might be less acceptable in Alabama. Which context do you look to, and if the answer is you have to do it by geolocation, et cetera, doesn't that partition the internet in a way that's fundamentally destructive?
I'm not going to, I'm not going to give you a quick answer to that question, because actually political theorists have been grappling with this question. Those people who've been working on multiculturalism and now, globalization have been struggling with this question for decades. What do we do when someone who comes from a polygamous society on religious grounds, moves to a monogamous society, and like how do we? So a lot of that question is just too I can't claim a way to answer it. The question I really want, I think people should think about that, and many think about it and many don't think about it. So, for instance, among computer scientists who maybe are building protocols for networks, they may say, well, the thing you really want to do is build neutral technology, and then it can be used accordingly in every different culture. And the thing is that, first of all, cultures are just not insulated from each other anymore. We have to evolve these common ways of interacting with one another, and I think technology is going to be one form of in this currency among the different cultures and traditions. But any policy that you're going to choose, no matter what it is going to confront that problem, and my solution is going to confront that problem too. That's all. I'm sorry, it's not a good answer. It's not an easy answer. It's just a hard question. Yeah.
So, Todd Davies from Symbolic Systems.
Oh.
Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question about how this applies to search, because I'm a bit puzzled about how it's fitting together.
Yeah.
If we go back to the quote from Larry Page that he put up, I mean, as I read that, it looks like he's not saying that you shouldn't have advertising-supported search engines. He's simply saying that there should be an alternative. It's not that. And if I think about search engines in a historical context like these other examples, what comes to mind is really the tools that we used in places like libraries.
Yes.
To find information, like card catalogs and the Reader's Guide to periodical literature and all that. Going to the library, look up, without any advertising appearing when you look for the book or magazine article or whatever. And you were able to do this with a lot of privacy, relatively speaking, and even some laws that govern borrowing and so on. So, but what you said in your talk made me puzzled about what your position on this actually is, because it sounded like you were saying you don't think it's important for us to have the equivalent of a non-commercial service that would be analogous to public libraries in this realm. So I'm just going to give you a chance to clarify.
Yeah, well, the way I'm going to clarify this is to say that I don't think that whether it's commercial or not should determine what the standards of excellence are. all needs to determine what the standards of excellence are. I mean, there was a time that when, in early days when I had written the article, The Politics of Search Engine with Lucas and Krona, in which I thought that some of the ways in which the more commercially driven search engines of the day, many of which do not exist anymore, were functioning was problematic because they were mixing in their commercial, the paid searches with the real searches, which is an interesting thing, an interesting idea. Anyway, and I thought then maybe one of the solutions that came up was maybe there should be a publicly funded search engine. Now I don't know necessarily that that's the solution to it, but I have argued that I'm a proponent of thinking of search engines the way we think of the public library, or the way we think about the kind of freedom and autonomy we demand in the realm of education and research. And one of the reasons why it makes sense for us to have a law like FERPA, which it's one of the few areas of law that we have, and obviously the privacy, people saying it's not strong enough, etc., but at least we recognize education, is because we believe that there's certain rights to freedoms that we have, and that is to do research without having any fear of surveillance. So I think of search engines, as one of the mechanisms that's equivalent for the web as public libraries are to freedom to conduct research. But whether or not that's provided privately or not, I could imagine a private library system that also adheres to very stringent privacy restrictions of the type that we enjoy. I mean, it's actually, I'm not saying that this may not happen, it may not come to pass. Those of us who have been following this, the case of prescription, the IMS health versus, who's on the other side?
ARD, is that the one?
Yeah, the Supreme Court case. I mean, basically, what we discover in that case is that pharmacists are selling out identifiable prescription records. So you may, I mean, there are things that are going on because information is just incredibly valuable. So there's a lot of pressure to do this sort of thing. Yeah.
I wanted to go back to your example when you were saying you were having surgery and you were signing the medical consent form. And you were okay with doing that because you placed trust in NYU and so forth. And my thinking is that maybe there's another reason why you may be okay, is that there's lack of competition essentially. So if you don't go to NYU for your surgery, you go somewhere else and they will also make you sign a consent form. And because you know that, that kind of leads you not to read and hope that you can place your trust in NYU. And taking that to the online data and kind of to what Ryan said about maybe we can get the consent correctly in the online context. I was wondering whether you see a role for competition in shaping these standards of excellence. So if there are multiple search engines and they have a different kind of contextual understanding of what is the traditional way to look at it, whether you see this competitive environment shaping one or the other to succeed or to find a reasonable solution for everyone.
Yeah, I just, no. And the reason I don't I'm not optimistic about that, not about many things I'm very optimistic about it, salad dressings, do it. Put all these different salad dressings, I'll taste them and I'll decide the marketplace is fabulous for that. But the problem, this is the very root of the problem, is that we actually don't have the right kind of information to base the decisions on. That's why I don't think the marketplace is right for this. It would be great. And is that me? Oh, yes, it's me. These people people who don't switch their cell phones.
Let's-
Okay,
I just wanna say
yeah,
thank you.
we-
So we are out of time.
Yes,
This was really
okay.
great. Thank you so much.